Well, we are so excited to be joined by Tom Kitt today. Tom has a BA from Columbia University in economics. We'll chat about that. He is a composer, arranger, orchestrator, music supervisor, producer, so many hyphens. He's composed shows like Next to Normal, Almost Famous, Flying Over Sunset, If Then, High Fidelity, Freaky Friday, many more. He's done arranging and music supervision for shows like American Idiot, Jagged Little Pill. He was an a cappella arranger for Pitch Perfect, the movie. He's won Pulitzer, Grammy, Tony, and Emmy Awards. That's a full EGBT, I think. If we're maybe we count the outer critics circle and we can call it an EGOT if you want. He's also a founding member of Muse, that's Musicians United for Social Equity, with multiple-time friend of the pod Michael McElroy and NYC Next. He's also a father of 3, including a graduating high school senior, which we'll talk a little bit about on the show. He's also a very handsome man. Tom, anything we missed there? Welcome on the show. How you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here.
We're discovering a New York Knicks fan, which is very exciting. I promise podcast guests we won't do another 10 minutes on NBA basketball. I've promised them. They're sick of it. Well, I'd love to start, Tom, if you can kind of journey back with me to 16, 17-year-old Tom, who ends up going to Columbia. But I'd love to sort of think about, like, what were you viewing college as back then? You know, basically in the different paths of what you could have seen in your life. Obviously, some of it might have been being an economist or whatever you do with an economics degree. But, you know, where did theater play into that? And sort of what were you looking for from the college experience as you approached college for yourself?
Well, when I was 16, 17, at that point, I had sort of immersed myself into pop rock, piano-driven music.
And you were a piano player yourself at that point?
Well, so I started playing the piano when I was 4, and I got classical lessons.
Yep.
And then when I would say probably 12, 13, at a summer camp, I discovered sort of early Billy Joel music. Those first albums, which were so pianistic, and I just was sort of gobsmacked by the arrangements and the sound, which led me to Elton John, and even though I had loved the Beatles at that point, immersing myself into the sort of piano-driven songs, Simon and Garfunkel. So this was all bubbling, and it formed in me this dream of becoming a singer-songwriter. So 16, 17, I was starting to write songs. I've been writing music my whole life, but started to try to write songs with lyrics and dream of becoming a singer-songwriter. And so college to me was as much about where that can happen, where I can continue to pursue that dream in New York City, of
being
course.
in New York. Yeah.
An amazing place to be.
And are parents influencing this too? Are they saying, hey, you got to get a BA. You're obviously smart enough to get into Columbia. Don't waste that brain of yours. If you want to go try singing song, like, are you getting that kind of pressure from parents? Was there any version of you thought about, maybe I want to go to a conservatory and study more music or that kind of thing?
My parents were incredibly supportive, and I'm the youngest of 3. So my brother and sister had already been through this. So I had been dreaming of college, just because I saw it happen in front of me with my siblings. My father actually has an interesting history. He's a former New York Yankee pitcher. He was a left-handed fireballing phenom who was signed out of high school, and then he ended up working in antitrust for a number of years. So it was his guidance really to say, nothing would make me happier than for you to pursue a life in the arts, but I think it would make sense for you to have something to fall back on.
And you got this great brain.
Economics, and I didn't know much about it. Took some economics in high school, but I really loved the major. And the best thing about it was showing up for college. I was a little bit of a mess. In high school, I was distracted. You mentioned the Knicks. Nights where I should have been studying for exams were me putting on the Knicks game. And, I'll just do it later. I'll do it later. And then it would never happen. So going to college, really meeting the student body, many of my friends who are still dear to me to this day, and of course, meeting my wife, Rita, I just became a more serious person in all respects. And if you're going to major in economics, you can't sort of sleepwalk your way through it.
You can't be watching the Knicks all day.
Terrified by courses like macroeconomics and statistics and econometrics that I just knew that I was going to have to become a much more serious person.
One of those you made up, right? One of those is a made up word that you just were testing us, right?
No. I wish they
Econometrics,
were
that's real? Interesting.
econometrics. Yeah, and it's as scary as it sounds.
Wow. This is why we study theater at this podcast. No, but so other than the sort of personal growth, that's awesome. And I think, we talk about that. Actually, the last episode, I was talking about that a little with our students of like, what the purpose of college is. That's not just about acting, singing, dancing, training for a lot of people who are pursuing BFAs in terms of personal growth and where you are in the world and all that great stuff. Other than that, from the Columbia experience, what did you get musically? I saw there was some a cappella in there, which I guess was some possible prep for Pitch Perfect. But were you, using really the city outside of college? Were you using college resources? How were you sort of continuing what would be then your ultimate career?
Well, there were a few really important things that happened. The first, I mentioned classical music as being something that I started out with, and then in high school, I was less interested in it. And going to college and taking courses on Beethoven and
Hmm.
Mozart, and a number of other courses I took, it sort of pulled me back into that world, and
Mm-hmm.
especially as an aspiring composer, I just found it opened up a kind of new language for me to draw
Uh-huh.
from that I hadn't appreciated in a certain way, and so I got a lot out of the music education at Columbia, and then also when I arrived at Columbia, I wasn't necessarily dreaming of being a composer for the theater.
Yes.
It was meeting Rita who introduced me to Brian Yorkey,
Uh-huh.
and then getting involved with the Varsity Show, which is a student-driven, student-written musical that's happened really since the years of Rodgers and Hart
Uh-huh.
meeting at Columbia. So it's got this long history, and writing the shows with Brian, that's what lit the fire in me to pursue a life as a composer for the theater. So I don't know if that would have happened if I hadn't
Yep.
been at Columbia at
But
that
the
time.
aspiration really from jump was to be a composer, to pursue music. It might have been to could be a pop singer, songwriter, composer, but you were going to try to write music from 18. That you knew that
Yeah.
already.
And then along with Mozart and Beethoven, I took there's a wonderful professor. Sadly, he passed, but Mark Tucker, who taught a class on Duke Ellington and a
Hmm.
class on jazz that were incredibly important and transformative for me.
Yep.
There was a class called Music of the U.S. where you got to dive into Charles Ives and Aaron Copland, and so all of these things were washing over me and kind of expanding my palette of where I could draw from as an
Yep.
artist.
And so you mentioned Brian Yorkey, with whom you're going to write the huge hit that is Next to Normal, giving you a lot of the E's and G's and P's and T's that you're getting in those awards. What was his timing in terms of, were you guys writing this in school, right after school? How did that work in terms of timing of graduation to, oh my gosh, now you're a megastar?
Well, Brian actually graduated with Rita in 1993. So the first show we wrote, 1994, I was a sophomore and Brian was a year out of
Wow.
school. But Brian was living up at Columbia and actually working for Miller Theater. So he was on
Hmm.
campus. And I think he pretty much stayed at that position, pursuing his other, not just writing for the theater, but other writing projects
Hmm.
he had until I graduated in
Yep.
1996. And then the two of us decided we wanted to continue writing musicals, and we had the aspiration of one day getting to Broadway. So we applied to the BMI Musical Theater
Uh-huh.
Workshop, which many people had said was a transformative experience, and highly educational world to be in. So we applied. We got rejected the first
Hmm.
year. We applied again, and we got in. And there's a timing aspect. If then came out of this idea of where are you in a certain moment. You
Hmm.
look at a moment as were you always fated to kind of arrive where you are, and not just being at Columbia with Rita and Brian, but also then being in the BMI Musical Theater Workshop with writers like Bobby Lopez,
Hmm.
Amanda Green, Curtis Moore and Tom Miser and Jeff Marks. It was an incredible group, and if we had gotten in that first
Whole different
year,
group.
who
Yep.
knows if and especially because Amanda and I, from the beginning, I was her musical director
Uh-huh.
for her cabaret show, which led to us writing together. So all of these important things happened just by fate.
Yep, that's so cool. Well, and I'd love to talk a little bit about some of these different jobs that you end up holding. I mean, they're all, I guess, related in some ways in that they're all musical, right? But like, if you thought I wanted to be a singer-songwriter, maybe originally, and then you go, maybe that means a composer for the musical theater. How does that then jump to being a music supervisor or an arranger or an orchestrator? Was that all stuff you're just like, yes, and I can figure out how to do this. I know how to compose, or I know what music is. Or I guess, it's a lot of different titles that you've held. And it seems like, as I look at it, not everybody who does one does all of the things the way that it seems like you do.
Well, I learned early on that the more skills you have, the more not just exciting jobs you'll be eligible for, but also it's about creating a life in the arts that feeds you and also literally
Uh-huh.
feeds you.
Uh-huh.
You can support yourself. Another really important, wonderful friend that I made at Columbia, Noah Kornman. Noah, after he graduated, started working with Kurt Deutsch and Melissa Justin at Chickaboom
Mm-hmm.
Records. And Chickaboom was doing these wonderful concerts. They would do holiday concerts or something, maybe in the spring, but they were always emceed and an opportunity for some of the most exciting talent in theater to perform. And they always had a house band
Uh-huh.
and needed a musical director. And I got into musical directing these shows where Sherry Renee Scott would perform, and Adam Pascal and Alice Ripley and Michael McElroy, as you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, and BIV. So I was making all these connections, and Mario Cantone would often MC the
Mm-hmm.
concert, and then he would perform as well, which led to me becoming Mario's musical
Uh-huh.
director. And one of the first music supervision, arranging, orchestrating jobs that I got to do was on Laugh Horror, Mario's show, that Broadway show, I think in
Mm-hmm.
2004. Also, another product I was pulled into was a project that Sherry Renee Scott and Dick Scanlon were working on, which became Everyday
Uh-huh.
Rapture. And working on Everyday Rapture with Michael Mayer then brought on American Idiot.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like laying the groundwork. One thing leads to another, and the more rooms you put yourself into and hopefully succeed, the more it's going to lead
Yep.
to.
Well, and it seems like there is a version of yes anding that, obviously these are all amazing opportunities that you're saying yes to, but I could see some people say, I want to stay in the lane that is composing my own stuff. I don't necessarily, in working on this other person's stuff, that would take away from that lane. And it seems like you've been able to really fuel and add to, and now,
Well,
all
my
these different things.
my philosophy, yeah, my philosophy is just any room where you can learn
Mm.
from and
Mm-hmm.
grow is a room you should try to be
Yep.
in. And to say, oh, I can only be doing this, you have to find the time. And there are moments where I'm writing where a project will be on hold for a little bit, and I need something
Uh-huh.
else to sort of draw inspiration from. So, what better thing to draw from than another exciting
Yep.
project? And as long as it's taking a creative part of
Yep.
you, that's
That's so
everything.
cool. Well, and just for those who may not be quite as up to date on all the different terms, including myself, who, I'm not sure I could define all the intricacies. What is the difference in terms of skill set of like what you're doing? Maybe I guess we understand what a composer is, and maybe that's as opposed to like a lyricist at times. But how is that different from when you've been a music supervisor or like an arranger or an orchestrator? What are those different, like, how do we define those different jobs within a show or within a different project?
Well, I think music supervisor can mean different things depending on the project. For me, on shows like American
Mm-hmm.
Idiot and Jagged Little Pill and Head Over Heels and SpongeBob, it's really to oversee the musical team and the
Uh-huh.
process that brings the show to fruition. And in those cases, because you have Alanis
Yep.
Morissette or Green Day, who are very much have very busy lives being rock
Yep.
stars and are global phenomenons, they can't always be in the
Yep.
room, and so you need someone who's speaking for the music team, kind of acting as a voice of the
Uh-huh.
composer, even though you're not the composer, and also helping to shape and create the show in its entirety, which means transitions, underscoring, reprises. It's not just the
Yep.
songs, and then that will naturally lead to arranging
Right.
work, because in getting those songs adapted for the musical, they will take on new arrangements
Different
because
instruments,
of
different.
different
Yep.
characters who are singing the
Yep.
songs, vocal arrangements. So once you have those song arrangements done, then that naturally feeds into the orchestrations where you're actually writing the
Uh-huh.
parts for the band that you're going
Yep.
to have. So that's been a very natural process for me. But I know that that's how I've come to
Yep.
define it. It can mean different things for
And
different
is that not
projects.
odd, I guess, in some ways? Like if you're rearranging some of these, of course, I got to really look at Jagged closely, but some of these absolute hit songs, now you're in charge of sort of like, hey, let me mess with this a little bit, and you show it back to Alanis, and then she goes, yes, I like what you've done with my. Isn't that kind of weird? Like I've beautiful wedding dress. I've made some edits. How do you think about this? Like, is that not an odd experience to be, especially in some of these cases? These are like mega celebrities that you're, saying, here's this platinum hit that I've made better for the theater or whatever.
Well, only here's something that I have, done work on creatively in terms of the story that we're telling, and things read differently on stage than they do in a studio. So it's never to change for change's sake,
I got some
or
notes. Let me
make it
just, make it a
something.
little poppier. I think I can.
No, it's just to serve the story, and find new colors that help with the
Yep.
adaptation. And I've often said, Green Day and Alanis Morissette, they're doing just
They
fine
sure
without
are.
Tom
Yeah.
Kitt. But if Tom Kitt can come and help, and with my knowledge of
Yeah.
theater, it's interesting. I came up with an example yesterday. I was talking to a group of artists, and I mentioned the song "Candle in the Wind" by Elton John, one of my favorite songs. And there's a studio version of "Candle in the Wind" where it's performed with the band and beautiful soaring harmonies. And then there's a version that I love, which I think they played on the radio quite a bit in the early '90s, which was a version of him just on the piano, recorded live in Australia with when he did a concert with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. And if you look at those two different versions of Candle in the Wind and you thought about a musical, they give you very different information musically. So in the first version, if there's maybe a big moment where somebody is in front of people or is declaring this in a grand way, you use the studio version. If it's a more intimate, sort of vulnerable moment, maybe you use you're drawing from the live version. So that's kind of what I think about. You take the song and say, here's the information that the world has received about this song. Now, how does it need to translate in the
It's
musical?
so cool. And, I really got to experience that with Jagged, going, I know and like these songs as the pop songs they are, but then you really love them and take them on in it's a different song. I mean, it's the same song, but you get such a different impact. And now I'm so used to hearing them in the musical. When I hear it on the radio or whatever, I go, what's that song? It's like a completely, even though that was the original thing. It's cool to see that art can sort of have that many different containers.
Well, the best compliment I got was on stage when Alanis Morissette was performing at the Apollo Theater around the time that Jagged Little Pill was opening. She talked about the arrangements on stage, and she said, I won't say for the podcast, but she said an expletive and said, beep you, Tom Kitt. I can't get these, I get all of your arrangements in my head, and I don't know which way to go. That was her way of saying, like, she, these arrangements now have become part of her, and she loves them. And
that's so cool.
So that was
cool.
amazing.
Well, and that leads me to, I had to ask about, you've worked with some just mega celebrities, from theater celebrities that we all know and love, like Dina or Lynn or whatever, but also like, Alanis Morissette, Cameron Crowe you just worked with. Obviously some of these, when you were working with Lynn or whatever, maybe it wasn't quite the same household name that he was going to become at the time. But now that you're traveling in these circles regularly, like, how do you handle interactions and collaborations? And like, especially when you have to work together so closely artistically, do you ever have that starstruck feeling? Do you ever feel like, oh my God, I'm still a fan of you, and here we are working side by side? What is that like, and how do you handle that as an artist?
Always. You're always starstruck. Recently for me, joining the team of Hell's Kitchen, working with Alicia Keys, Adam Blackstone. There's a moment when you walk in the room and you're just kind of like, wait, how did I get here? Now, you're just so in awe. And then you have a job to do. And if you belong in that room, you're there to offer important creative energy. So you kind of just get past the fan part of you and the starstruck part of you, and then try to just talk as collaborators. And if you can see that part of it, then
I love that phrase, if you belong in that room. So if we zero in on that, what made you feel like you belonged in that room? Like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, do you feel like you belonged as a composer and that lets you write next to normal? Or do you get a next to normal and then you get some awards and that makes you feel like you belong? Like, how did you find, you're talking about a kind of confidence that I think many artists, even if they do belong in those rooms, don't always feel that I have a voice that should come up and that I should be able to speak in it. How did you find that confidence to go, I belong in this room?
Well, I think that I just always aspired to be in those rooms. And if I want to be the kind of artist that I dreamed of being, I want to do great things in the world, or ambitious things. And so the confidence comes from the
Mm.
ambition. Um, but of course, you need support and you need people to be there and tell you that the
Uh-huh.
work matters. And I remember early on with American Idiot, I wanted to just put the band at ease to show them that if they needed to hear their album intact, sound pretty much the way
Uh-huh.
they made it, I could recreate that for them. But then I wanted to just show a few nuances to hint at what could be and just follow my instincts and see if that was going to
Mm-hmm.
be interesting. And it was a gamble for me because it easily could have gone the other way. And they said, wait, what? No,
Uh-huh.
put that back. But some of those gestures, one that I can really point to is the last song on the album, What's Her Name, that I began rather than the way it begins on the album with just a solo piano and then sort of um, bringing in slowly and gradually
Uh-huh.
a string section. It's something that they pointed to immediately, and that was a huge moment for me because I thought, okay, my instincts are in the right place, and it is speaking to them. And if I continue to follow these instincts, no matter what the project and who I'm working with, and I'm totally ready for someone to say, no, that's I hear where you're going, but let's talk about this. It's
Yeah.
not quite right yet. But those instincts have served
Yeah.
me well,
No, I
thankfully.
mean, you wear those both very well. The boldness to take risks, but the kind of obvious humility of like, please tell me if this is wrong. Like it feels like you would walk in a room. You would not be a hard person to give a note to and go, no, Tom, this is terrible. Change it back. Like, I don't think people would feel that way, even though you've got your egopatas and all
No,
those things.
no, I'm ready to
Yeah.
ready to come up with another
What
version
about,
when it's
especially
needed.
for some of our actors or musical theater people who enjoy plays as well? You've also done some composing original music for plays, right? Some big plays, as well as All's Well That Ends Well for Shakespeare in the Park, where I first encountered you. But that, whether it's Shakespeare in the Park, whether it's a new play, how do you see that role as, sort of composing music for plays that are not musicals versus composing a musical? How do you take on that different task, or what that's been like?
Well, I love writing incidental music, and I did actually three scores for the park. I did Cymbeline and
Yeah,
Winter's
and somehow
Tale,
Oswald didn't
as
end up on your
well as
Wikipedia. I'm like, can I get Tom? I know, I saw him in that room. He was there. Well, get in there. Yeah, it's fine.
Winter's Tale was the first one that I
Mm-hmm.
that I did with Michael Greif, and then Cymbeline
Mm.
and Oswald Ends Well with Dan Sullivan, and it's a
Oh
lot
wow.
of music because they both wanted not just transitions but underscore, and so it's a real skill to get out of the way of the language.
And are you fully
But
understand? Like, do you feel like you have to imbibe and understand the Shakespeare to write that? So you have to be
Yeah,
like, I know this play
yeah,
backward. I always thought that when you write, I was like, he really is underscoring the moment. That means you have to like do text work.
yeah. No, I did text work, and I read through it
Yeah.
with the directors, went through it with them, and then on my own, and you get things
Uh
also
huh.
just from listening to it and being in the room. So I love
Mm.
those experiences, and it's definitely a different part of you to write music that has to both tell story but
Right.
not
You
be
don't
too
want to take over
present.
because the language is in charge. You're. Yeah.
Although I did get to write some
Uh huh.
songs, which was also fun. I think I wrote four songs in
So cool.
Cymbeline, and yeah, so it was. It's something that I love doing, and if I could parlay that into
Uh
film
huh.
scoring, because that's some of
Yeah.
my most favorite music has been film scores. So I would love to
But it
have
seems
that
like
opportunity as
some of
well.
that, right? The pitch perfect a cappella arranging happened. We're speaking that more and more into the world. Let's get more of that for Tom. Come on.
Yeah, yeah, that was a great
That's so good. How did that
experience.
come about? How did you
Um,
book that, and what was that like different than the theater world of it all?
Well, I had met with I'm very good friends with Jason Moore, and we were having lunch one day, and he mentioned that he was taking a look at this, and I said, "Oh, you have to do that, and not only that, you have to hire me to work
That's
in
the
the movie
confidence we all
because
need, Tom. That's
it's
it. You
one of
have
my
to hire me.
talent
Yeah.
experiences. Acapella was I was in an acapella group for all 4 years at Columbia, so it became two teams. I was collaborating in New York
Uh
with
huh.
Ali D, and then there was a wonderful team led by Deke Sharon on the West Coast, and we just kind of the
Like you're
assignments were
doing the
divided up.
acapellas, they're doing the ladies. Is it like that? That simple or?
It's not all all
Yeah.
all hands on deck, but I was happily and luckily
Oh,
handed the riff
yes.
off to work on,
In
and
the
so I worked
bowl,
on the
where
riff
they're
off
down
for
in the
all 3
bowl and they're all
days.
from the movie one? Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, 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 the thing that ends with,
Yes,
"No
that was
diggity."
awesome.
That was really fun to put together. I have all these demos. I would get all my friends from Broadway to come in
And just do the riff
and
off?
do
My
these
God, I
demos.
didn't even know to give you credit for that. That's
So
awesome. Cool.
yeah, yeah. So sometime I go and I listen to them. There's the
Yeah, yeah,
songs that didn't make
that'd be
it.
a good, like, whatever decade I guess it's been more than a decade, whatever, a re-release of, what are the non-riffs that didn't make it. Um,
There was actually a Christmas album that was going to be done, and sadly it didn't come to be. But there was an arrangement that I did. This was again being led by Jason Moore of "In the Bleak
hmm,
Midwinter"
hmm,
with River, uh, and Adrian Warren and Emma Hunton
hmm,
are singing
hmm.
against each other, and it's quite beautiful. So I'm sad that that never
We're
saw
gonna bootleg
the
that
light of
in
day.
conjunction with this podcast. Put it on. It's in the show notes of the podcast. Click it. We're gonna include it as a secret bootleg for all of you listeners. Well, I love that. Leads me just to the last question. Then we'll take a little break. It's just talking about collaboration, right? So you've worked with these amazing playwrights, lyricists, screenwriters, and all different also musical teams. What is that collaborative process for you? Especially now, it seems like in 2024, a lot of this is happening remotely and digitally. It's not the same maybe as being in a room. You're tinkering around the piano, someone else is with you. How does that work with the back and forth of, are you sending each other files back and forth? Are you do a bunch, they do a bunch? How does that work in general when you're doing that kind of collaboration?
Well, I got used to that early on, even before the internet, because Brian Yorkie and I were often on other
Hmm.
coasts, opposite coasts, I should say. So we would work from, I think at that time I was using a mini
Huh.
disc player in the 90s, a little microphone, and then I would have to take the mini disc and convert it
And then
into a
mail it to him?
CD and CD. Or,
Wow.
yeah, I don't even remember when I started emailing
Mm-hmm.
music files, or if we would just be on the phone, or if we would just hear it for the
Uh-huh.
first time together in rehearsal. But it's certainly ideal to be in the room. But now you can really through Zooms and then through
Uh-huh.
voice memos, you can get a
And
lot
what does that look like
accomplished.
in terms of assuming maybe something you're composing and someone else is writing the lyrics for, which I know it's not always identically that process, but if that's the process, are you compose first, then someone adds lyrics? Do you have the lyrics that inspire the composition? Do you do it all different ways? Is there sort of one way that you tend to like to go back and forth?
It's not one way; it could be either. Often I'll get a lyric first because that
Mm-hmm.
feels organic to the process, figuring out what the song is going to literally say. And what's so amazing about working with Brian is that Brian is so musical. I'll get a lyric that's beated
Uh-huh.
out in terms of the rhythm, so
There's already a
it's very
container of
easy to
like
write with
it's going to be
Brian.
this kind of
I'll
line. You don't have to sort of figure that
Yeah,
out. Yeah.
I'll get a kind of musical tempo
Uh-huh.
and feel immediately from
Uh-huh.
looking at his lyrics. But that's been the case with all the Amanda Green, Nell Benjamin,
Uh-huh.
Lin Manuel Miranda, and then now working with Cameron Crowe. It's just an incredibly exciting process. Michael Corey on Flying Over Sunset, where when you're working with someone new, you have to just get a sense of how the process
Yeah.
works, and sort of get your you know the what's the word I'm looking for? Just kind of feel out where how everyone creates.
Yep.
But once you kind of hit that sweet spot, then I the writing for me usually happens fast and furiously.
I love it. All right, we're going to take a short break because I want to dive deeper into this, into the composition process on the back end. So, a quick break. We're back in a flash. Okay, we're back with the great Tom Kitt, and we're going to dive a little deeper into the process. So, I want to talk about like what that composition process looks like for you personally. Maybe before we get into the specifics of composition, I would just love to kind of hear from a work ethic perspective. Now you're juggling three kids, many projects, lots of different hats. We talked about the 5 or 6 different hats you might wear within an artistic process. What does that creative time for you look like? Are you a set 4 a.m. to 7 a.m.? I do all my composition person. How do you sort of sit down at a piano and carve that time out for yourself?
Well, I do like to work early. That's when I
Hmm.
find myself the most charged and inspired. In the evenings, I tend to get tired, and an idea will just start to get heavy.
Uh huh.
But usually in the morning, I just feel kind of rebirth and energy to get going and figure things out. And I have started as early as I was on vacation actually over the break, and there was one morning I woke up at 4:30. I couldn't. I just once I started thinking, I
Hmm.
couldn't stop, so I went down to the lobby and worked from 5 until 8 o'clock in the morning.
Mm.
So if it's gonna happen at a burst, it's usually in the morning, and it'll be depends on how I'm working. If I'm looking at something in terms of lyrics, I'll sit with the document in front of me and just start to try to formulate some thoughts. If it's music, I will sit at the piano or sit as I am right now. My keyboard is literally right here in front of me.
Mm-hmm. Well, sure,
And
play us a little something, Tom. While we're chatting, if you want to tinker around, let's do some composition right here on the pod. Why not?
but yeah, just start to tinker around and see
Yeah.
what's possible. And usually something will form, even if it's something on the way to an idea that I'll come back to later.
And is it more of a tinker? Like you're going to sit down like with a blank page and tinker, or do you like do you hear melodies come to you? Like when you woke up at 4:30, you were like, "Oh my God, I've got something," or was that like I'm solving the crossword puzzle from what was already there from yesterday?
It's usually not hearing a melody. It's usually I'll sit down, look at the piano, and then just start to play some chords
Hmm.
that will start to turn into something.
And what is that experience? Like I can understand the experience of writing words as someone who's not musical myself. Like how do you see or hear? Like how does chords turn to eventually the full orchestration? Obviously, you're not going to be able to tell us all how to be composers, but like inside your brain, how does boom boom whatever then eventually turn into a full song? Like I guess that's so opaque to me as someone who's not musical in that way.
Well, if I'm writing a song by myself, usually the lyrical ideas will come with melodies. So I'll have something that I'm ruminating on, and then I'll just start to form some ideas. And then I have to determine whether I continue with the lyric or I continue with the music.
Uh huh.
Often I'll continue with the lyrics so I can get a form, and then I'll go back to the music and write it to that lyric.
And music
If I'm
means melody. Like you're going to hear a melody. Yeah. Uh-huh.
yeah, melody, some kind of contour. I wrote a song actually on break in my head. I hadn't even actually tried it on the piano until I got home, but it was kind of hooky, and there was an energy that for me was every time. Sometimes when I look at the lyric, even if I had music in my head previously, I'll
Uh-huh.
forget what the music is. But this was so strong an idea for me that I never. As soon as I looked at that hook, it suggested the music
Okay,
right away.
here's a dumb question because I feel like this is what would happen to me if I tried writing music. Do you ever like write something in your head and be like, this is the greatest thing ever, and then discover this already fully is a song? Like I feel like I'll do that where I'm like, did I make that up or am I singing something that I've already heard?
No, that happens sometimes. Sometimes it'll be something I've already done. It's actually a better.
I already
It's more
wrote this
of
song.
copying for myself than I can. But yes, and it's like okay, there's something about the energy of this music that is speaking to me. How do I make it my own?
Uh-huh.
How do I ride this energy in a new way?
Yep.
It's much better if you recognize that. Hopefully, it won't come to be that some years later someone will get a phone call.
You'd be like, whoops, this sounds too similar.
Yeah.
And then what about, we talked a little with the orchestration process. When you're adapting an Alanis or a Green Day or, any of these wonderful things that you've adapted or orchestrated, I should say, what are the things that you're thinking about that turns it into, because I want to talk a little bit about pop versus musical theater sound. What do you feel like turns it more into a musical theater applicable song compared to a pop song? Like, what are some of the changes that going in? I'm probably going to be doing this to this Green Day song.
Well, I don't know if I know before I get into the process and the story. It's really about the book
Mm-hmm.
informing how the music is going to be. But most importantly is to come into the process with a real knowledge of the sonic palette that already exists.
Mm.
So I knew with American Idiot, Jagged Little Pill, that there was going to be that I wanted to lean on the brilliant work that was done on the record, and know that, and then see where a new adaptation might speak to the work. So, for example, a song like "You Ought to Know," right, an
Uh-huh.
iconic, groundbreaking rock song. But when we saw how it functioned in the story, it became obvious to us that the song needed stillness at the beginning and needed sort of a quiet simmer
Uh-huh.
from the character. So rather than begin with a groove, begin a little at a time, begin a little stark,
Mm-hmm.
and then see where it leads. So that informed everything
Mm-hmm.
as the song begins, and then it's how does that build, 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 and then when do you actually drop into the
Yeah.
groove, and that becomes the second verse.
Yeah.
Same thing with I reference what's her name. I knew I was eventually going to get back to the groove of the song. I delayed it for the whole first half, and then there's a little musical interlude that then sort of brings on the electric guitars, and then when you drop into the I would say what is the B section of that song, then you have the full on groove. But it's a little bit of a puzzle. It's between the album and how we know the music and what the musical is doing that makes it want to feel a little bit different. Again, serving the composition, not changing anything, but in terms of the DNA of the song. But one thing that really spoke to Billie Joe Armstrong was when I referenced George Martin and his work with the Beatles, because you look at a song like Yesterday, which would be wonderful on a solo guitar, but how much does that string quartet add? And I think that in many ways, George Martin was the fifth Beatle, all of the orchestral work that he did. And when I mentioned that is how I saw my work on American Idiot, that Billie Joe got that right away.
You just called yourself the fifth Beatle. I mean, this is the kind of confidence we're talking about. No, but it is so, I mean, that is so, it's so interesting, and it's so like theatrical in a way, what you're describing of like the effect of, and I got to see You Ought to Know a bunch of times, like the effect of that growth, that build, which is like the building blocks of theater is always this build and change, is so satisfying theatrically when we then get to the concert moment where it's like, now this is the song that we've expected, we've earned it, we've built toward it. It's really interesting and theatrical. I mean, I'd love to talk, because I do think like you are, about as much of an authority on sort of Broadway pop rock as exists in this world. Like, just from a stylistic perspective, if we maybe turn to the performer's point of view, which many of our listeners, of course, are focused on the performing style of it. We know Broadway has long since been overwhelmed by pop rock. 20 years ago, we started doing this and it was like, you should have a pop rock song. That's the future of Broadway. And now it's like, that is clearly the present of Broadway is pop rock. Do you still see these styles as distinctly different musically? Like, I'm not always sure I can tell when it feels like, well, this is a song being popified, or this is a pop song being Broadwayified, or I'm not even sure those feel like completely distinct categories. But do you feel like there is such thing as like a pop rock sound, which is different than a Broadway sound in 2024?
I always get nervous when people try to make generalities about styles or, functions of music. I think that the term rock musical came out of a time when it wasn't seen very much on the Broadway stage. So it really did clue in for people that this was the sound you were going
You're not
to
going to see
hearing.
The Music Man tonight. You're seeing something different.
But now there are so many wonderful musicals being written that incorporate a huge palette of styles. And so I feel like what for me the constant is that songs written for the theater need to tell story and however their musical needs them to. And if you're going to say, I'm going to write I want to write a musical that incorporates punk rock. Punk rock has a DNA to it that you're going to want to utilize. But, if you talk to Billie Joe talks about his influences, the Beatles being a huge one. So even in his own writing, there are other influences outside of what you might term punk rock. So at the end of the day, you're just trying to draw on what's going to tell the best story, what's going to serve the dramatic moment. And then if you have a certain idea about how you want the music to feel, how you want it to sound, you have to know what that language is. So I think that authenticity is all about how you see the musical feeling and sounding and what kind of story that you're telling. But you can get into the weeds a little bit about how pop is working in this versus this, and this is a Broadway sound versus a non-Broadway sound. I don't know necessarily if I would want to get too bogged down by all of that and just say, if I break down the production on this Alanis Morissette song, I hear how the instruments are functioning, how they're talking to one another, I hear how it's arranged, the kind of sounds the guitars are getting. But at the end of the day, they come out of what someone wrote. And you can't just put on, the Alanis Morissette hat and be Alanis Morissette. She brings her natural gifts to the writing, and that's at the end of the day what defines the show. No matter how the instrumentation is, it's how do you write music, and that's going to be the sort of lifeblood of the show.
Well, what about from the performer's perspective? You know, when you're in the room auditioning actors, whether you're going to have a big voice in them passing or not the audition, but you know, what is the creative team looking for from a musical theater actor when you're singing in a pop rock context of a show? You know, what are some of the things that, you know, it would be helpful, I guess, for our artists to hear of, like, oh, she didn't, like, are people saying, I don't know if she's got the right sound for this show, or I don't know if she gets the style or the vibe? Like, I think that's the kind of thing I think a lot of our students are concerned of, like, am I bringing in enough of a Green Day vibe, and what that might be if I'm auditioning for American Idiot? Or do I feel Alanis Morissette enough for this show, or for maybe my role isn't that, but do I need to still show that I've got some idea of that style? Like, how do you think about that from a performer perspective?
Well, I think about it the same way that I do as a pianist. If someone expects me to come in and play a certain style of music, and if someone hands me sheet music that is from this musical versus this musical, can I, as a pianist, is my knowledge of music enough to make both songs sound the way they need to? So I think as a singer, how do you reference this style versus this style, and how does it all feel musical and natural to your sound? You know, Elizabeth is a wonderful example of someone who can do everything, right? You mentioned you were just hearing opera in the other room. And this is coming from the same voice that was belting Forgiven 8 shows
within
a
that
week.
same musical too, also singing plenty of kind of legit different, I mean, just so much range even within that musical. I was like, my God, you gave me a masterclass vocally. And she was not straight tone belting the entire show, you know, and yeah, totally.
So it's really about what kind of artist do you want to be? What kind of music do you want to be interpreting? Do you want to be able to do this show versus this show? I don't think you should put pressure on yourself. My friend Daisy Prince, I said words of wisdom, which is, if you do one thing really well, that's a lot. And don't put pressure on yourself to do everything well. Obviously, if you can, great. But the most important thing is, if you're coming in for a certain show and you've done some research and the show has a palette like such and such, you need to be able to walk into the room and interpret the material the way the creators are hoping to hear. That's going to be important.
It's really interesting the way you talk about from behind the piano too, that you're showing a fluidity of, I can play this and this, and I can match what the moment needs. I do think sometimes actors are a little afraid of going, if I show you this other side, you might decide I'm not punk rock enough for this. Or if I show you this sound in my voice, you might think I don't sound right. And they sort of almost try to be forcing their voice into something that they may be expecting you to hear.
And decide if you want to sing that music. And if you are singing punk rock, if you are singing a rock show, it's going to be taxing in a certain way. I'll never forget when Mary Maisie said to me when she was rehearsing next to Normal, and she just said, this is my instrument and this is how I speak through it. And I don't know if you're needing it to happen like this in this moment, you may be used to. And I said, Marion, you're here because I revere you as an artist, and I want your version of the character. And it was that, again, another great lesson for someone who just comes in and says, this is my instrument. I'm going to protect it, but I'm going to go to the umpteenth to give you everything you need. But, I can't change the DNA of who I am, and I don't want to do something that's going to hurt my instrument.
Coming back to
everyone has to be really knowledgeable about that and upfront about that. And because your voice, especially, that's going to be everything. You need to protect it. It's your life's work.
Well, coming back to that idea of, the confidence of I belong in this room. I often tell young actors that you cast me. You don't always have to say that out loud, but I'm like, remember, they cast you. You've been cast correctly in this show. Assume it's not a mistake. And so then what can you do from your body, from your instrument? What is your artistry bringing to it? We want that perspective, hopefully, if we've cast you. Is there anything else from, performance perspective, just from being on the other side of the table, seeing so many auditions, seeing so many amazing performers work, any kind of tips that you would have to a young performer as an interpreter of your material, as a collaborator with you, just as they're auditioning, anything that you go, I really wish young actors knew this a little more?
A couple quick things I would say. One, don't have anything in your book that you don't like singing. Don't put things in your book to check boxes. And if you need to check boxes, make sure that every song, no matter what style, that it speaks to you the same
Mm-hmm.
way. You are hoping that someone in the room might say to you, "Hey, can we hear
Mm-hmm.
something else?" Because you have 8 or 9 other things that you are
Mm-hmm.
dying to sing that day. And don't populate your book with a million
Mm-hmm.
things. Just have your true tried and true
Mm-hmm.
songs that just again speak to you and you can't wait
Mm-hmm.
to sing. um, Walk into the room confident. The room is hoping that you are the person, so ride that energy. And even if you don't necessarily get the job, if you wow the room, they're going to take
Uh-huh.
notes and they're going to call you back for
Mm-hmm.
other things. Every good audition moves the needle
Mm-hmm.
for you, even if it doesn't mean you get that job. And take your time. One of the things that I see um, that speaks a little of being new or having lacking some experience is someone who tries too hard to put over any kind of
Uh-huh.
movement or gestures when they're singing. It's something that working with an acting coach, getting into an audition
Mm-hmm.
workshop, and just finding a way to relax. I always want to see the musician in the singer. I don't need someone to motivate
Uh-huh.
story if the song doesn't
Uh-huh.
want it. So if you're doing a pop song, for example, and there's a lyric and you have some music before the
Uh-huh.
next lyric, someone who kind of looks around the room or takes a big
Mm-hmm.
breath or tries to just fill the
Mm-hmm.
space, decide if that's the right song for you. And if it is, then you have to figure out how
Uh-huh.
stillness and confidence exists in that moment and not trying too hard. And all of these things, just your ease in the moment, both musically and in terms of just feeling um, sort of at ease, are going to speak to everybody on the other side
That's
of the
great,
table.
great advice. All right. Well, what about, and please only share what you feel comfortable with in terms of your personal life, but getting to experience a little bit of the college process yourself as a parent now. Your oldest is a graduating senior, and I understand potentially considering to dabble in the music, maybe the theater world. It seems like there's still some possibilities there. So, how did you navigate him expressing that interest, and then you trying to kind of evaluate the college process and what he might get out of college, and that same thing that you tried to do yourself at 16, 17, all those years ago?
Well, I'm very happy that my son identified early on a
Mm-hmm.
passion for something. I think that that's huge. If that was everything for me, I knew that music was going to guide my life, and it's the same for him for acting. So Rita and I wanted to make sure that we um, were presenting, helping him find um, destinations that were going to be really
Mm-hmm.
wonderful for that part of him. But he's a teenager, so there was a little bit at times of a lack of
Uh-huh.
urgency about it, and it's a huge process to get all of the materials together. His school was, I can't say enough about how how wonderful they were in
Mm-hmm.
driving this process, meeting with us. But it's a lot. It's a lot
This
that you
is
have to
not new
do.
information to anyone listening to this podcast. They're all like, yes, we know, Tom Kitt. It's very hard. It's a
Yeah,
difficult
yeah.
process.
Well, I'm saying it for what we've been through. Um, but at the end of the day, I also feel like Michael was he just had his
Mm-hmm.
sights set on a certain kind of place that he
Yep.
wanted to be at to help his growth and to pursue what he wants to do. So, the other great thing about the school that he goes to is they drew a limit on the number of schools
Mm-hmm.
he could apply to. So it wasn't going to make him too
Uh-huh.
scattered, and just brought a little more focus into
And
the
what do you see
process.
as the value of college for him in this field specifically? And recognizing obviously not all of our listeners have EGOPT winning parents to help guide them and maybe even potentially help make connections, those kind of things. But did that influence how you thought about school for him of going, hey, we already know. I know some people I kind of know enough in the business. I think so many of our parents are in the opposite situation where they go, I know nothing about the business. I need a place that's going to teach him something. Like, did that factor into, the school needing to have a showcase or the school needing to have, any of those kind of things in the way that you considered him looking at undergrad?
Well, I don't want to be the kind of parent who says, "Well, because it was like this for
Uh-huh.
me, this is how it's going to be for you." Um, my children need to come to their own conclusions and find their own path. But I can say that, and granted, there are plenty of people who have discovered stardom at an early age, who may have spent only a small time in
Mm-hmm.
college or not gone to college, and it is quite a commitment in
Yep.
all respects. Um, but what I found for me is that I needed to
Uh-huh.
grow up a little bit, and the experience of being on my own in a wonderful place to get an education and discover new things, be in a place like New York City where the city itself was an education. I just was a very different person at 22 than I was when I
Uh-huh.
arrived at 18. And I needed that time. And I think the person I am, the artist I am, that experience was everything for me. So I think that my son is going to benefit from having these 4 years to continue his
Yep.
growth, to have a sort of um, not worry about having to get out there and work and
Yep.
find employment, but continue to experiment and find who he is and be around people who are going to inspire him
Yep.
and teach him as well.
Anything you feel like if you did it again and you're going to get to do it twice more, anything you feel like you learned from just the college process? Could be the college theater process, but also just the kind of college process of going, God, I can't believe I have to do this twice more. Like anything you feel like next time I'm taking this into it.
Oh, if
No,
I
no, I mean
myself
for
was
your
going
kids,
into
you got to do it
college,
twice more for your. I'm saying you got to go through this process again. Is there anything you go? All right, next time I'm going to say this sooner. This I'm not going to stress as much about. Like anything you feel like you learned from going through the college process.
I don't know. I don't. I mean, I think that my kids are all they just wow me in
Mm.
so many ways, and I have the confidence that when they get there, they are going to get everything they need out of it. I mean, if I looked at my own experience again, like high school, it took me a little bit to get the seriousness
Hmm.
of where I was, and um, but once I was there, I really just immersed myself and did a lot of activities and got a lot out of the experience, and I hope that
We just
it's the
had a
same
lot
for
of
my
parents
kids.
slam on the brakes on different highways across America, going, "What? Your kids wow you? They did it all themselves. They're like, I can't get my lazy kid to do an essay." I'm just saying, this is not everyone's experience of the process, but so awesome, and I guess a testament to you that that's how you feel about it. That's really great. All right, my last question is a silly one.
Yeah.
It's just, are we going to get a Tom Kitt led performance musical soon? Right? You see how Lin Manuel puts himself, he double dips in all of his Disney properties, and can we get that? Can we get a Tom Kitt leading a musical? Is that coming on the horizon?
I don't know. I really enjoy
Are you sure?
watching these
Alicia Keys,
incredible,
maybe
brilliant
you can step in,
performers.
and is there not a role for Tom Kitt to get out there?
I love being
An
on my side of the
acapella coming
table
out?
and
No,
giving up and handing over to these brilliant
we'll see.
artists. There was something that Green Day said when they saw American Idiot, and they said we've had to be Green Day our whole lives, and now we get to sit back and watch
Hmm.
someone else be Green Day, and they just found it so inspiring. And I think that I just get so much out of watching other people up there and take something that I created
Hmm.
and run with it and speak to it in ways that I didn't know
There's at some
existed.
point there exists the Tom Kitt band. Is that still around? Is it? Do we get to see you there?
Now, there's something. Now, if I was able to get the band together and do more performing and find myself someday at a place
You
like
got
the
two
Bottom
tickets. You got
Line,
two tickets
that
to
would
were purchasing for front row for that. I promise. We'd
so
all
yeah, the
text you
dream
back.
of the singer songwriter. I made an album in the pandemic
Yes, yes.
with Elizabeth, of course, among other brilliant performers, called Reflect. So that's something that I would love to do.
So cool. You've given so much wonderful advice already to art, especially in the room, and you talked a little about your own parent experience. Is there any other advice that you would just give to our parents out there? Many of our listeners, of course, are parents of students who go through this process. Any advice from? It doesn't have to necessarily be for the college part of it, but just as a parent of a performer in this industry. In terms of what you have seen work and not work as people have navigated it.
I think try to listen to your kids. Try to play both parent and support.
Hmm.
Um, they are teenagers, so there is going to be a little bit of a lackadaisical at times, I imagine, and the urgency in them might not be the urgency in you. But just try to be gentle and not force anything,
Hmm.
and do whatever you can to push them to educate themselves because it's a big commitment and it has to be the
Hmm.
place that they are feeling is going to speak to them. That being said, we know that the college process is so competitive and so difficult that there is a sense of, well, where will we get in? What will our options
Hmm.
be? But I think the more that you listen and just try to guide, the better.
You heard it here, folks. Tom Kitt, an advocate for gentle parenting. My parents disapprove of Elizabeth and my gentle parenting, but that's a whole other podcast for us to get into. Tom, thanks so much for coming on the show today. This was such a pleasure.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And I wish everybody out there good luck.